So good to see everyone who's returned this evening for our study at 5 o'clock. Also, we have visitors with us for which we are always very, very thankful. And tonight we have some very special visitors. Eddie and Barbara Dunn, former members here, members who are loved and remembered very much for their work's sake while they were with us. Our loss was Abilene's gain, and so it's good to see Eddie and Barbara tonight. What we're looking at and have been looking at is 7 cries from Calvary. 7 cries from Calvary. The first cry from Calvary were words of forgiveness. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. Luke 23 and verse 34. The second cry from Calvary we looked at this morning. It was words of assurance. Assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Luke 23 and verse 43. Well, tonight, here's our study. The third cry is from John 19, verses 25 through 27. Scott just read these words to us a moment ago. Now, as we continue tonight, here are some things I want you to look for. The selflessness of Jesus, also the strength of Mary, and the servitude of John. We'll come back to these at the end of our study, but be thinking about these and be noticing these as we go through our study tonight. In John 19, verses 25 through 27, read this with me. It says, Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. Now, before we actually get into that context, step back to the very end of verse 24. The last thing we read before we're introduced to this group of friends, loved ones of Jesus, the last thing we read is this: Therefore the soldiers did these things. John has spoken concerning what the soldiers have done. Then he moves into the next scene. Really, what we're looking at is a stark contrast. This scene right here concerning the soldiers, it's one of the most terrible scenes you'll see in the Bible. But it's followed by one of the most tender scenes found within the Scriptures. But therefore the soldiers did these things. What things has John mentioned? They crucified him. Verse 23. They divided his garments. Verse 23. And they cast lots for his seamless tunic. Verse 24. And so, therefore, the soldiers did these things. Now it follows, now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Notice this. The theme, really, the lesson that we began this series with was entitled, Jesus, Keep Me Near the Cross. That last song that we sang. Well, think about this. Those that we're introduced to right now, that's where they are. They are near the cross. Jesus, keep me near the cross. As we said when we introduced this lesson, if anything should keep us near the cross, it's a series like this. You know, this series has really only just begun, but already several have mentioned how much they appreciate it, how much they have gained from it thus far. And I will say this, if the words of Jesus from the cross will not, cannot, do not resonate in our hearts, then there's something seriously, there's something scripturally and spiritually wrong with us. Remember in Luke 9 and verse 44? Let these words sink down into your ears. That's certainly what we ought to do with all of these sayings from the cross. But Jesus, keep me near the cross. I want to be and I want to stay where these are said to be. Now there stood by the cross of Jesus. Well, notice, in the weaker vessels was the greatest strength. Men, do you see who's mentioned here? Now, evidently, it's John, that unnamed disciple, in his own account of the life of Christ. But we're looking at the ladies. They're there at the cross of Christ. They're near the cross. And so again, isn't it true, in the weaker vessels was the greatest strength? It's true on so many occasions. We ought to be thankful for our wives and our godly sisters in Christ. In Matthew 27, verses 55 through 56, and also Mark 15, verse 40 and 41, it seems like, we'll read these in a moment, but it seems like they began near the cross. And as the scene progressed, as death drew near, evidently they moved farther away. Now, with that in mind, let's read what Matthew says and what Mark says, and keep this in mind because it's going to help us with the next point also. But look at Matthew 27, beginning in verse 55, reading through verse 56. It says, "And many women who followed Jesus from Galilee, ministering to him, were looking on from afar." Notice that. Right now, as Matthew records it, they're looking on from afar. Verse 56, "Among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of Zebedee's sons." Well, turn, if you will, to Mark 15. Notice what Mark records. Really, it's the same emphasis here. He mentions again their proximity to the cross. Mark 15, verse 40, and also verse 41, it says, "There were also women looking on from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, the mother of James the Less, and of Joseph, and Salome, who also followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem." Now, this is important for the following reason. The statement in John's account, his mother's sister, this, as we've noted, was probably Salome. When you put the context together, all of these are mentioned: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the wife of Clopas, or the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, the same person. Now, some people, when they read verse 25, they see 3 ladies. Others say there's 4. Personally, I believe there's 4. Read the verse again. "Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother," well, there's the first, "and his mother's sister," I believe there's the second, "Mary, the wife of Clopas," the third, and Mary Magdalene. Some take those middle 2 and combine them. His mother's sister, and then they say, explaining who that was, it's Mary, the wife of Clopas. It seems a little bit odd that there would be 2 sisters in the family named Mary. You remember the old Newhart show where the man would come in and say, "This is my brother Darrell, and here's my other brother Darrell"? Well, in that kind of a family, it doesn't seem strange to have 2 named Darrell. But here, to have 2 Marys would seem a little bit odd. And so most commentators concur that when you look at Matthew 27, when you look at Mark 15, when you look here at John 19, his mother's sister is the mother of Zebedee's children. She is Salome, and the mother of Zebedee's children when you go to Luke 5 and verse 10, are James and John. And so, that being said, if this is so, then John is Jesus' cousin. Maybe that explains, again, why in Matthew 20, again, Zebedee's, the mother of Zebedee's sons, comes to Jesus and asks him for a favor, that in his kingdom she wants one of her sons to sit on the right, one of the sons to sit on the left. Again, this would be his aunt. Maybe because she was a near relative, thought she could ask that, thought that that could be granted concerning her sons, his cousins. But nonetheless, it's interesting to think about this. Notice also in John 19 and verse 26, it says, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Now, think about this verse for just a moment. That first phrase really captivates me. Notice what it says again, when Jesus therefore saw his mother. I don't think we can understand the emotion that had to be involved in that statement and had to be involved in those circumstances. The eyes of our blessed Lord the last 2 days saw many things, most of them quite horrific. But now the Bible simply says, when Jesus therefore saw his mother. What a comforting sight that must have been. We have the old saying, what a sight for sore eyes. And it certainly had to be. When Jesus therefore saw his mother. Look at this quote. Christ yearned over the mother whose heart was being pierced by his agony. That's what one person said concerning this scene. Again, you go back to Luke 2 and verse 35. Remember what Simeon prophesied? That a sword would pierce the soul of Mary. Well, obviously, this is coming to pass. And a sword is piercing her soul at this time. She's near the cross of her beloved Son. And Jesus sees his mother. Here's another quote. Even in the midst of intense pain, Jesus thinks of everybody who ought to be thought of. Keep that in mind. We talked about the selflessness of Jesus. Can you imagine? He's being crucified. He is in excruciating, intense, unbelievable pain. But even now, he thinks of everybody who ought to be thought of. And I might add, some who didn't need or deserve to be thought of. What have we already looked at? He thinks, first of all, of even those who were guilty of him being there. His murderers. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they do. In intense pain, he's thinking about them. This morning as we studied, his fellow sufferer. Assuredly, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. So he's thinking about his murderers. He thinks about his fellow sufferer. Now he thinks about his mother. And so read this again. Even in the midst of intense pain, Jesus thinks of everybody who ought to be thought of, and the disciple whom he loved. Well, in John 13 and verse 23, listen to what the verse says. In this context, it's written, now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom he loved. Well, that disciple is thought to be John. As he writes this account, there is an unnamed disciple throughout this account. We'll see him again in John 18 and verse 15. This disciple is known by the high priest. But it seems that in humility, John does not put his name in here. But this is reference to himself. Could be why he doesn't mention his mother's name earlier, Salome. It's simply, his mother's sister. So the humility does not allow him to mention his mother's name, nor his own name, but he's the disciple whom Jesus loved. And that phrase, woman, notice what we put here. This appellation is not an expression of coldness. This term implies absolutely no disrespect, but high regard. I think sometimes we trip ourselves up because in our English language we have two terms, woman and lady. And of course, woman is the lesser of the two. And then we take our common vernacular and we hear Jesus saying, woman, behold your son. Well, in the original language, there is no disrespect intended. There is no coldness, as one commentator suggested. This is still a term of high regard. Likewise, Jesus was not so absorbed in his own agony and suffering to forget his own mother. Keep that in mind as we continue just to mention some things. He is on the cross. He is in intense pain, but he's not so self-absorbed in his own agony, in his own suffering, so as to forget his mother. Think of it like this. While bearing the burden of the world's sin, he yet had room in his heart for his mother. Isn't that incredible? Not only is he suffering intense pain, but the reason for him being there, he is bearing humanity's sin. Add that to the physical pain, but yet he still thinks about his mother. Thus, while providing for the spiritual needs of the world, he does not forget the physical needs of his mother. We put here, what a wonderful example, model to all children. His mother's welfare was one of his last concerns. He wanted to make sure that she was provided for. The Christian son will be the most affectionate to and caring of his mother. Young men in the audience, did you hear that? And not only young men, but all of us. Again, the Christian son will be the most affectionate to and caring of his mother. You remember Exodus 20 and verse 12? Honor your father and your mother. Remember Leviticus 19 and verse 3? Reverence your mother and your father. Remember Ephesians 6 and verse 1? Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Colossians 3 and verse 21, obey them in everything. The Christian son, the Christian daughter, is going to do just that. Well, let's move on. In John 19 and verse 27, then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour that disciple took her to his own home. Notice, John became Mary's adopted son. It was now his responsibility to care for her. And look at this. There was no need for a long lecture. Only a brief statement was required. Jesus did not have to try to convince John to do this. It's just a brief statement, isn't it? Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother. It's a lot like Galatians 2 and verse 10, when they reminded Paul to remember the poor, and he said, it was the very thing I was eager to do. He didn't have to be persuaded to do that. It was the one thing, the very thing he wanted to do. And such certainly seems to be the case with John. Doesn't have to convince him, just simply a brief statement. What an honor for John to take Jesus' place. Have you thought about that? This is a tribute to John. This is an honor bestowed upon John. Why John? Well, in John 7 and verse 5, remember, Jesus' brothers were not believing on him at this time. Evidently, after the resurrection, they did. But at this time, they're not believing upon him. And so that might explain why John. Again, John 13:23, the verse we've read, we know the intimate relationship, that loving, caring relationship that existed between Jesus and John. And so maybe because of that. Also, we mentioned this verse earlier in John 18 and verse 15. Remember, John is known by the chief priests. It might indicate a social status, a social standing. We know that he was partner with Peter in a fishing endeavor, so possibly he was well off, known by those in high places. But I know this, whatever we can say, he and Mary, John and Mary, were kindred spirits. Who's at the cross? Well, Jesus' mother and the disciple whom he loved, Mary and John. What better man to entrust the care of his mother to than John? Also, tradition says that Mary continued to live with John in Judea until her death about 15 years later. Now, as we've looked at some points concerning this context, remember what we said. Keep in mind the selflessness of Jesus. We see that everywhere we find Jesus, but certainly here. His selflessness in life and in death, he puts others first. He puts others before himself. In fact, let me remind you again, the first three statements on the cross are for others. Before he turns his attention to his own needs, as he will in the last statements, before that, though, he's thinking about others. Father, forgive them. Today you will be with me in paradise. And woman, behold your son. Remember Matthew 20 and verse 28? The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. In Luke 22 and verse 27, Jesus said, I am among you as he who serves. The selflessness of Jesus. Romans 15 and verse 3, he did not please himself. In Matthew 26 and verse 39, not my will, but thine be done. And so we see on every page of the Scriptures, when we see Jesus, we see selflessness. The selflessness of Jesus, but also the strength of Mary. Remember, who is it near the cross? Mary and other ladies. But Mary's there. But think about this, not only the strength of Mary, but the silence of Mary. Have you ever considered her silence? She is the only one that could have put a stop to all of this. Before Jesus was ever sentenced to the cross, she could have put a stop. She could have said, this is my son. His father is Joseph. He's beside himself. He's deranged. He doesn't know what he's saying. His claims are not true. She didn't do that, did she? She was silent. Why? Well, think about this. She understood that this son conceived in her was conceived of the Holy Spirit. She understood that Joseph was not his father. And she understood as far back, remember about the age of 12, when they leave him in Jerusalem, come back, and Jesus said, I must be about my Father's business. Separating himself, not in an unkind fashion, but to get the point across, separating himself from his, quote, earthly father, Joseph. I must be about my Father's business. She knew that even now on the cross, this one, Jesus, was about his Father's business. Her silence speaks volumes. Her silence is deafening. She could have saved her son, but at what cost? And so her strength is seen in her silence. But not only the selflessness of Jesus, the strength, the silence of Mary, but the servitude of John. Go back with me to John 19. Read with me what the Bible simply says concerning John. Again, in verse 27, then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. Now notice this. And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. And from that hour. Isn't it interesting? There's nothing like Luke 14 and verse 18 in this context. They all alike began to make excuse. John did not make an excuse. He gratefully accepted the responsibility from that hour. Remember John 2 and verse 5, what Mary had said about Jesus earlier? Whatever he says to you, do it. John had that attitude. Whatever he says, I'm going to do it. Behold your mother. From that hour, that disciple took her into his own home. Wouldn't it be great if every one of us developed that same attitude, that same mindset, as we read and study the Scriptures, as we look at God's commandments? As soon as we hear them, we're going to attend to them. From that hour. What did the Bible say in Hebrews 3 and verse 7? Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 2, now is the acceptable time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. Yes, this third saying from the cross. It follows words of forgiveness, words of assurance. These are words of affection. Woman, behold your son. Behold your mother. Let's once again let these words sink down into our ears. And let them produce in our lives the same loving servitude, the same attitude that says, whatever he says to me, I'm going to do it. Tonight, if you've never obeyed our blessed Lord's gospel, if you've never obeyed his commandments to hear the truth, to repent of your sins, to believe in him, to confess his precious name, to put him on in baptism, then let's become obedient from this very moment as John was. If you have need to respond tonight, won't you come while together we stand and sing?
When we walk